You are now settling in, the lights around you dimming, your mind beginning to drift toward quiet places where history feels like memory. The world outside is rushing, but here you can take your time. I invite you to listen as if you are sitting with me in the stillness of night, as if my voice carries across decades to meet you where you rest. This is my story, though for a time you may not know my name. But perhaps that is fitting because I was born into a family where names carried weight heavier than blood, and where destiny was whispered long before I learned to speak. My earliest memories are not gentle ones of childhood innocence, but the shadows of illness and the stern gaze of a father who believed greatness was not a gift, but a demand. I was small, frail even, my body failing me more often than not. Fevers came like tides, bones ached, doctors shook their heads in silence. Some wondered if I would survive into manhood at all. Yet in that fragility I discovered something, a way of carrying myself that concealed the pain, a smile that masked the weakness, and a charm that could soften the harshest expectation. It was not enough, of course. In my family, survival was not victory. My father, a man of relentless ambition, wanted not children but instruments, vessels through which his vision of power would be realized. He had seen the world stage during times of chaos, had touched both politics and finance, and he burned with the idea that one of us, his sons, must claim the place he believed destiny owed us. I grew up in a house filled with competition, brothers clashing, striving, trying to outshine one another beneath the weight of his approval. There was love, yes, but also rivalry sharpened by tragedy. For in our family, fate had already demanded sacrifices, a sister lost, another's mind hidden away, and for each blow, my father's resolve only hardened. We were to be strong where others had fallen. We were to rise no matter the cost, and yet I was the one who faltered most often. While my elder brother strode forward, tall and confident, destined in everyone's eyes to be the standard bearer, I lay in hospital beds with my back twisted in agony, my organs betraying me. They tried treatments that seemed closer to torture than medicine, braces that crushed me, surgeries that carved at me, injections that left me reeling. And all the while whispers followed, "He is too weak. He will never last. He cannot be the one." But weakness, I learned, can be hidden. Pain can be folded into silence. And when you smile brightly enough, when you laugh with enough ease, the world forgets that you are suffering. I became skilled at that performance. The young man who looked like health and charm, even as I collapsed in private, even as I swallowed handfuls of pills to dull the fire in my spine. Even so, I could not escape the burden of expectation. My father would not permit it. He demanded from us not only obedience, but victory. He had no patience for failure, no tolerance for excuses. And so I pushed myself into schools where my body rebelled, where long nights of fever left me pale in the morning light. My companions saw only the humor, the easy grin, the mischief I used to keep their curiosity at bay. But inside, I carried the weight of knowing that I was a substitute, a second son expected to perform miracles if the first could not. It is strange looking back how much of life feels guided not by our own choices, but by the shadows of those who came before us. I wanted at times to simply vanish into quiet anonymity, to study, to write, to think without the constant gaze of a father measuring my worth. But every time I tried, the tide of family pulled me back. My brother's path was marked, and so mine had to follow close behind. Yet there was one thing illness gave me that others did not possess, an intimacy with mortality. I knew from an early age that every day could be borrowed time, that each breath might be snatched away by something unseen within me, and so I began to live with urgency, to taste the moments more sharply, to throw myself into experiences, adventures, conversations, and risks that others might hesitate to touch. If I could not be certain of years, I would seize the days. It was during those years, fragile yet defiant, that I discovered something else, a taste for storytelling. I learned to draw people in not by force but by words. A story told at a dinner table could silence the room. A joke whispered in the right moment could disarm anger. And when I stood before a group, even in my youth, I felt something awaken, a voice that carried farther than my frail body ever could. But of course, charm is not destiny. And while I practiced the art of words, history moved around me with violent speed. Wars flared, economies shattered, and the world demanded not boys but men willing to bleed for causes larger than themselves. I watched the newsreels, the headlines, the faces of soldiers departing with uncertain futures, and somewhere in that storm, I felt the pull. Despite my broken health, despite my doctor's protests, I could not remain only an observer. What would come next would test me in ways no childhood illness ever had. It would place me in waters black with oil and fire, clinging to survival as the ocean threatened to claim me. But that is another part of the story, and it begins with the decision to step beyond the safety of privilege and into the heart of war. The walls of our house were lined with portraits that seemed to watch me as I grew, faces of ancestors frozen in oil and canvas, their gazes heavy with expectation. To be born into my family was to be born into a dynasty in the making, one crafted not by centuries of nobility, but by a father's relentless will. He had clawed his way up from the fringes of acceptance into the glittering circles of power, and he never let us forget that what he had earned through cunning and ruthlessness could just as easily be lost if we faltered. He was a man who believed money was a tool, not a prize, and reputation was a weapon sharper than any blade. Every move he made was calculated, every friendship a transaction, every setback a temporary obstacle in a larger war. In such a household, love was expressed not through tenderness, but through ambition. My father did not cradle us with gentleness. He shaped us as one-shaped steel, pounding until sparks flew. His voice, deep and unyielding, carried an authority that brooked no hesitation. When he looked at me, I felt both the weight of his expectations and the measure of his disappointment, for I was not his first hope, not the shining sun destined to lead. That role had belonged to my elder brother, strong and brilliant, the apple of his eye. The future had been carved for him, and I was meant to be the shadow trailing behind. But destiny is cruel, and in our family it proved merciless. My brother's path ended in the flames of war, leaving behind a void that no one wished to acknowledge, but that I was forced to fill. Suddenly the burden shifted, and all the dreams my father had poured into one vessel spilled into me. I remember the day of that transformation, not with triumph, but with a sense of quiet dread. The glances around the house changed, whispers circled, and I knew that I was no longer allowed the luxury of frailty. Whether or not my body could bear it, whether or not my heart longed for another life, I was now to become the heir to my father's vision. The Kennedy household, as the world would one day know it, was not a place of calm domesticity. It was a forge of politics, a training ground where ambition was drilled into us as naturally as breathing. At the dinner table, conversations were less about family warmth than about strategy, alliances, world events, the missteps of rivals. Ere silence was mistaken for weakness. My siblings and I learned early how to argue with force, how to defend ideas, how to spar with words until sparks of intellect filled the room. Those who could not keep up were left behind, their voices drowned by the louder, sharper ones. It was a place where wit was sharpened daily and where silence was mistaken for weakness. My mother, for all her grace, played her role in this machine as well. She believed deeply in discipline, in order, in the presentation of perfection. Behind her polished manners lay a steeliness that matched my father's in its own way. She understood that appearances mattered, that the world saw not our secrets but the facade we presented. And so we were taught to stand tall, to smile with elegance, to hide pain behind charm. It was a theater, and we were its players, each expected to perform flawlessly. Yet beneath that sheen of perfection lay fractures. The tragedies that touched our family were carefully hidden, spoken of only in hushed tones. A sister lost in a tragic accident, another confined to institutions after a procedure meant to quiet her mind left her a shadow of herself. My father's ambitions for us did not waver even then. If anything, they intensified. Each wound only deepened his resolve that the remaining children would rise higher, shine brighter, achieve what fate had denied to the others. And so, while grief touched us, we were forbidden to linger in it. The march toward power was unrelenting, and none of us could afford to stumble. As I moved through the corridors of privilege, I could not ignore the whispers that followed my father's name. His dealings in finance, his ventures during the dark years of prohibition, his friendships with men of questionable reputation, all were subjects of rumor. Some called him brilliant, others dangerous, a man who bent the rules to his will. To us, he was both a tyrant and a guide, shaping our futures with an iron hand. I knew that the money that paid for our schools, for the grand homes, for the elegant gatherings, was not always earned in ways polite society would bless. Yet I also knew that without his cunning, we would not be where we were. This contradiction was baked into the marrow of my life. The knowledge that the path to greatness was often paved with shadows. It was in that crucible of wealth, expectation, and secrecy that my own character began to harden. I learned to observe quietly, to study people, to listen beneath their words. My father often reminded me that true power was not only in what was said, but in what was left unsaid, in the secrets one held about others. He taught me that loyalty was fleeting, that alliances shifted like tides, and that the man who survived was the one who anticipated betrayal before it struck. It was a harsh lesson, but one that would prove invaluable when I stepped into the wider world of politics. Even as the burden of destiny pressed down on me, I could not escape the lingering fragility of my body. Illness stalked me through those years as well, and though the world saw a young man of privilege, within I remained at war with myself. There were nights when I lay awake, my back aflame, my stomach in knots, wondering if I would survive long enough to fulfill the role thrust upon me. But I had long since learned the art of concealment. To my family, to my peers, I presented the mask of vitality, the mask of charm. Few saw the truth, and fewer still were allowed close enough to understand it. In the midst of these struggles, I found refuge in ideas. Books became both escape and weapon, offering not just stories but strategies. History fascinated me. The rise and fall of empires, the decisions of leaders, the delicate balance between charisma and power. I devoured the works of philosophers, statesmen, and poets, weaving their lessons into my own growing understanding of the world. And as I studied, I began to see a strange symmetry between the ancient tales and my own life. Families torn by ambition, men scarred by private battles, leaders defined as much by their flaws as by their triumphs. It comforted me to know that I was not alone in my contradictions. Still, no book could fully prepare me for the role that lay ahead. My father's vision did not allow for retreat into scholarship. He demanded action, visibility, influence. He wanted his sons not merely to learn of history, but to shape it. And so I was pushed onto the public stage, groomed for a life that would leave little room for hesitation. The cameras that flashed, the reporters that scribbled, the crowds that gathered, these became the new realities of my existence. The stage was set, and I was expected to step upon it, whether I felt ready or not. As the years turned and I moved closer toward that world of politics, I often reflected on the contradictions of my upbringing. The warmth of laughter with my siblings against the coldness of my father's gaze, the opulence of wealth against the quiet tragedies hidden behind our walls, the lessons of resilience taught by illness against the demands of a destiny I had not chosen. These dualities lived within me, shaping not only the man I became, but the leader I would one day be. Yet in those days, I was still just a son under the shadow of a father whose ambitions knew no limit. Every step I took was measured against his expectations. Every word I spoke was judged by whether it advanced the family's climb toward power. It was a suffocating burden at times, and yet in a strange way it gave me purpose. For better or worse, I was being shaped into a vessel of something larger than myself. What none of us could see then was how fragile such a destiny truly was, how quickly the tides of history could shift, how easily one man's rise could be undone by forces beyond his control. I carried within me both the weight of my family's ambitions and the quiet fear that I might never truly escape the frailty of my own body. And yet, beneath it all, there flickered a stubborn fire, a determination not merely to survive, but to prove that I could bear the burden no one thought I was strong enough to carry. It was that fire that would drive me into war, into politics, into the heart of crises that threatened the world itself. But before those days came, before the lights of the world's stage turned fully upon me, I was still just a young man living in the shadow of power, learning to wear the mask of strength while privately battling the weakness within. What came next would test every lesson I had learned, forcing me into the crucible of survival in ways neither my father's ambition nor my family's wealth could shield me from. And once I emerged from that trial, nothing would ever be the same. The war had a way of stripping illusions from even the most sheltered sons of privilege. I had grown up in houses where the curtains were velvet, and the voices around me spoke of power as if it were inherited, inevitable. But the sea did not care for dynasties, nor did it bow to family names. When I joined the Navy, I carried with me not only my father's ambitions, but the weight of my own frail body, stitched together by doctors and fueled by stubbornness. Many thought I would never last, that my back would betray me, that the illnesses which had haunted me since childhood would finally claim me. Yet I went, because I could not bear the thought of standing apart while others my age shouldered the world's burdens. They gave me command of a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, a fragile craft meant to dart through the night seas like a wasp, striking swiftly and vanishing. I was young, too young perhaps, but my smile and my words convinced men to follow me, to trust me. They saw in me a confidence I often doubted in myself, but the mask I had worn all my life now became a shield, not only for me, but for them. We were brothers on that boat, bound together by the knowledge that the ocean and the enemy gave no second chances. I remember one night above all others, a night when the stars were veiled by smoke and the water was black as ink. We were on patrol, engines humming, when out of the darkness, a Japanese destroyer cut through the waves like a predator. It struck us with brutal force, slicing PT-109 into splinters. The impact hurled us into the water, fire dancing across the sea, the screams of men mixing with the hiss of fuel and flame. In those moments, the world slowed, and I felt again the weight of frailty pressing upon me. My back seared with pain, every breath a battle, but there was no time for surrender. Men looked to me, men who trusted me, and I knew that if I faltered, they would die. So I swam. With a rope clenched between my teeth, dragging a wounded comrade through the waves, I fought against currents and exhaustion that threatened to pull us all beneath. Hour after hour, stroke after stroke, until the shore rose before us like a promise barely out of reach. My body screamed with every movement, my vision blurred, but I held on because I had to. And when at last we staggered onto the island, I collapsed, not in triumph, but in silence, knowing that survival was only the beginning. For days we lived like ghosts, stranded, weak, half-starved, praying for rescue. I remember the taste of coconuts, the feel of sand burning beneath the sun, the way silence wrapped around us, except for the occasional rumble of distant gunfire. I remember fashioning messages on shells, carving words into a coconut husk, sending local islanders to carry it through dangerous waters. Each hour stretched into eternity, each glance from my men a reminder that their faith in me had to be answered with strength I was not sure I possessed. But somehow we endured, and rescue came. That story, told and retold, became a legend, a tale of heroism that newspapers would one day print as proof of my courage. Yet, what they never wrote was how fragile I felt in those hours, how close despair had come, how my body trembled in secret when the others slept. They did not write of the fever that racked me, the doubts that whispered that perhaps I was not meant to lead. Legends rarely leave room for weakness, and so I let the myth grow. But in the quiet I knew the truth. Survival was not born of invincibility, but of desperation, of refusing to let others down even when every muscle cried for surrender. When I returned from the war, medals pinned to my chest, I carried more than scars. I carried a sense of having cheated death, of walking away from the ocean's claim when so many had not. It gave me both urgency and melancholy, urgency to live fully, to seize whatever years remained, and melancholy that so many others had not been granted the same chance. I could not shake the image of faces lost to the sea, voices silenced too soon. They haunted me, and in some way they drove me forward into the next chapter of my life. But war also left me with pain that never fully vanished. My back, twisted and shattered, became a constant companion in suffering. Doctors worked on me, surgeons cut into me, and still the agony returned, sharper, more insistent. I became a man who smiled for the cameras while secretly relying on a cocktail of pills, injections, and sheer willpower to stand upright. Few knew the extent of it. Fewer still were allowed into that circle of truth. To the public, I was youthful, vigorous, full of charm. Behind closed doors, I was often doubled over, fighting to conceal the truth. It is strange how pain shapes perspective. Where others saw only the glitter of victory, I felt the weight of fragility. Where others saw a hero, I saw a man who had barely survived. Yet it was that very contrast that gave me my edge. I understood mortality in ways others did not. I understood the urgency of time, the need to move quickly, to speak boldly, to act decisively, because the future was never promised. Rumors followed me even then, whispers about my reliance on doctors, about the quiet experiments with treatments that seemed more like guesses than cures. Injections of strange substances, bottles of pills whose names blurred together, desperate attempts to wrest control from a body that seemed determined to betray me. Some would later call it recklessness, others weakness, but I knew it was survival. Without those interventions, I could not have stood before crowds, could not have walked into halls of power, could not have played the role history demanded of me. And so, when I stepped back into civilian life, I was not merely a veteran, but a man reshaped by suffering. The ocean had taken from me the illusions of invulnerability, and the years that followed would demand that I wear the mask of strength even more carefully. Behind the mask, the doubts remained, the frailty lingered, but the fire of urgency burned brighter. I had survived where others had not, and that survival became both burden and fuel. The war had proven one thing to me, that leadership was not about the absence of fear, but about carrying it silently so others could believe. It was about standing tall when your body wanted to collapse, about speaking with confidence when your heart whispered uncertainty. It was about becoming a symbol even when the man beneath the symbol was deeply flawed, deeply human. Those lessons would follow me into the world of politics, where battles were fought not with torpedoes, but with words, not on oceans, but in the minds of citizens. I returned from the war with a story others wanted to hear, with a name that began to echo in political circles. I returned with scars that the public did not see, but that shaped every decision I would make. And above all, I returned with the knowledge that the path ahead was no longer just mine. It was a path watched by my family, demanded by my father, and expected by a nation that did not yet know my face, but soon would. What began in the waters of the Pacific did not end there. It followed me into every speech, every campaign, every whispered doubt that I was not strong enough to endure. Yet it also gave me a strange kind of power, the knowledge that even in the darkest waters, when all seemed lost, survival was possible. That belief, fragile yet fierce, became the foundation upon which everything else would be built. And soon I would discover how quickly that foundation could be tested in the ruthless theater of American politics. The first time I stood before a crowd as a candidate, I felt the same nervous current that had carried me through dark waters years before. Faces stretched out before me, strangers waiting to decide if I was worthy of their trust. I knew they saw a young man with an easy smile, tailored suit, and a story of wartime heroism. They could not see the stiffness in my back, the dull ache in my joints, the pills hidden in my pocket. They saw only what I allowed them to see, and that was enough. The words I spoke had to lift them, to stir something deep, to make them forget the doubts whispered by my opponents. I began in Congress, a path paved not only by my name, but by my father's careful planning. Money flowed where it was needed, allies appeared at the right moments, obstacles quietly dissolved. There were those who said I had been handed what others had to earn. Perhaps they were right, but inheritance alone could not keep the crowds listening. Once the microphone was in my hands, once the questions were hurled at me, it was my voice that had to carry me forward. I discovered quickly that people longed for something beyond statistics and policies. They longed for hope, for stories, for the sense that their struggles mattered to someone who seemed untouchable, yet spoke as if he had walked in their shoes. Politics was a performance, and I had learned the art of performance from childhood. I laughed easily, I spoke with warmth, I let silence hang in just the right places. When I smiled, it was not only with my lips but with my eyes, and the crowds leaned closer as if I was speaking only to them. Inside, of course, I often felt the weight of exhaustion, the days of shaking hands, giving speeches, enduring endless dinners left me wrung out. But I could not allow the mask to slip. My father expected perfection, my family expected victory, and I knew the whispers would return if I faltered. He is too weak. He cannot endure. The early campaigns were not without humiliation. There were nights when halls stood half empty, when my words fell flat, when newspapers dismissed me as a lightweight propped up by family fortune. My opponents spoke of my youth as though it were a crime, of my privilege as though it erased all effort. They reminded voters of my father's dealings, his scandals, his enemies. I bore it silently, responding not with anger but with charm, deflecting with humor, letting the attacks dissolve into the air. Yet beneath the laughter, I burned with determination. Each slight was fuel, each doubt a reminder that I had something to prove not only to the public, but to myself. I learned quickly the importance of image. Photographers became both allies and threats. A single picture, a single frame could capture either vitality or frailty. I practiced standing with shoulders squared, jaw lifted, hands relaxed, even when pain coursed through me. I knew how to tilt my head so that light caught my features in ways that softened and strengthened all at once. My wife would one day perfect this theater beside me, her grace turning every appearance into a tableau of elegance. But in those early days I was learning alone, aware that every glance, every gesture was being recorded, measured, and judged. As the years unfolded, my name began to take on a rhythm in the mouths of voters, a familiarity that softened skepticism. I moved from Congress to the Senate, each step a tightening of the stage lights upon me. In the Senate chambers, I found myself among men hardened by decades of politics, men who looked at me with equal parts amusement and suspicion. They thought me a boy playing at statesmanship, but I listened more than I spoke, studied more than I debated. I learned how power moved quietly behind closed doors, how alliances were forged not with speeches but with whispered promises and debts to be repaid. It was in those halls that I began to glimpse the possibility of something greater. The presidency was not yet mine to claim, but it lingered like a shadow at the edge of vision. My father hinted at it, my allies speculated, and I could feel the pull of destiny tightening. I had survived illness, survived war, survived the expectations of a family that consumed its children. Why not this? Why not reach for the highest stage of all? Still doubts circled. There were whispers about my health, about whether I could endure the grueling demands of leadership. There were rumors about women, about nights spent in shadows, about temptations that seemed to follow me no matter how carefully I stepped. I deflected these with charm, with practiced ease, but inside I wondered how long the facade could hold, how long before the cracks beneath the surface broke through. Yet I pressed on. The world was changing and I wanted to be part of that change. I spoke of a new generation rising, of courage, of vision. I let my words carry the weight of ideals that others had long abandoned. People leaned in because I sounded different, because I offered not only policy, but poetry. And though I knew much of it was theater, I also knew that belief once stirred could move mountains. By then my name was no longer hidden in shadows. The crowds knew me. The nation began to know me. The identity that I had carried in silence, the one you have long since guessed, now stood in the open, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I was no longer simply the frail boy who had cheated death, or the son of a ruthless patriarch. I was a rising figure on the national stage, a man with stories of war and dreams of leadership, a man both admired and doubted, loved and whispered about. And though the path ahead would bring triumphs that glittered and failures that cut deep, in that moment I felt the swell of possibility. I was stepping into history, and history was waiting with both arms open and knives hidden behind its back. The campaign for the highest office in the land was unlike anything I had ever endured. Every moment was a test, every word weighed, every gesture magnified. The year was 1960, and the nation stood at a crossroads, weary from the past, anxious about the future and restless for something new. I offered myself as that newness, a fresh face in a world where old men had long held the reins. My youth was both my greatest weakness and my sharpest weapon. They said I was too inexperienced, too fragile, too handsome even, as though charm could not coexist with substance. Yet I leaned into it, knowing that in a nation yearning for vitality, my image could be transformed into a promise. Television became the battlefield on which much of that war was fought. For the first time, candidates were not only heard, but seen in every living room across America. My opponent, a seasoned man with years of government service, spoke with knowledge and confidence. But the camera was merciless, catching beads of sweat, the tightness of his jaw, the fatigue etched across his face. When the lens turned to me, it found a man who seemed calm, poised, and collected. The truth, that I was bracing myself against pain, that my body ached with every movement, remained hidden behind the mask I had worn for years. Viewers did not see frailty, they saw vigor, they saw youth. And in that moment, many decided that I belonged in the future, while my rival belonged to the past. It was not only the debates that carried me forward, but the story we spun around me. I was presented not merely as a candidate, but as the face of a new American dream. My wife, elegant and luminous, became part of that image, her grace reflecting a sense of renewal that the country found intoxicating. Crowds gathered not only to hear me, but to see us, to witness a vision of leadership wrapped in glamour. They called it Camelot, though the name would come later, when memory softened into myth. At the time, it was simply a family stepping into the blinding lights of history. I remember election night, with a clarity that has never dimmed. The returns came in slowly, the numbers tightening, the air thick with tension. Each state that swung in my favor felt like a step closer to destiny, yet doubt gnawed at me until the very end. When the final tally confirmed what so many had deemed impossible, I felt not triumph, but a strange quiet settle over me. I had become the youngest elected president of the United States, the first Catholic to take that oath, the inheritor of both hope and suspicion. The morning after, as I prepared to step into a role that would consume me, I felt the full weight of history pressing down. The grandeur of the office was intoxicating, yet the responsibility was suffocating. I thought of my father, who had dreamed of this moment long before I had dared to imagine it. I thought of my brother, whose death in the war had left this burden to me. I thought of my mother, who had drilled into us the necessity of perfection. And I thought of the people, millions of them, who now looked to me not as a symbol, but as their leader. The early days of my presidency were filled with light. Crowds lined the streets, cheering as my motorcade passed. Children waved, women leaned forward for a glimpse, men spoke with cautious admiration. The air buzzed with the sense that a new chapter had begun. Yet beneath the pageantry lay the machinery of power, cold and grinding, indifferent to charisma. Decisions waited that could not be softened with a smile. Crises brewed that would test more than words. I remember the first time I sat alone in the Oval Office, the room quiet except for the ticking of a clock. I looked at the desk, the portraits, the flags, and for a moment, I felt the enormity of it all. Here, decisions would be made that could alter the fate of nations. Here, words spoken could send young men to their deaths or bring them home. I was still the boy who had fought against illness, still the young officer who had swum through black water with a rope clenched in his teeth. But now, I was also the man whose choices could ignite wars or avert them. The weight was overwhelming, and yet beneath it, a current of exhilaration pulsed. The press could not resist the story we offered them. They photographed us in sunlit gardens, on yachts, with children in our arms. They wrote of style, of elegance, of a family that seemed carved from marble and kissed by fortune. The myth of Camelot began to weave itself, even as reality remained far more complex. Behind the smiles there were arguments, betrayals, secrets I could never allow to surface. Yet the image endured, polished and gleaming, a fairy tale that made the hard edges of politics appear softer than they were. But even in those early days, shadows gathered. I knew that my youth, my charm, my family's money, all invited suspicion. Enemies within the halls of power waited for me to stumble. Allies measured me with cautious eyes, wondering if I could withstand the storms that history would soon unleash. I had stepped onto the grandest stage, but the stage was surrounded by knives. Still, I pressed forward with speeches that stirred the heart, with promises that reached beyond the moment. I spoke of new frontiers, of a nation strong enough to bear burdens, of a world where freedom would endure against tyranny. My words soared, and for a time, belief followed them. But words, no matter how powerful, would not be enough. Crises loomed, and soon the world would test not my speeches but my resolve. Even then, I sensed that the glow of Camelot would not last forever. Glamour was a fragile shield against the brutalities of power. The nation had welcomed me as a symbol, but it would soon demand proof of strength. And I, carrying both the urgency of borrowed time and the frailty of a body that betrayed me daily, knew that I had to give them that proof, no matter the cost. The glow of celebration had barely settled before reality tested me. Power was not abstract now. It came with crises waiting on my desk, each one capable of unraveling everything I had built. The first blow came with the Bay of Pigs, an operation conceived before my arrival but executed under my watch. On paper, it promised swift success, exiles trained and armed, ready to reclaim their homeland from tyranny. In practice, it was a disaster, a humiliation broadcast to the world. I remember the reports streaming in, the sinking realization that men were stranded, captured, dying, and that the United States under my command had been exposed in failure. I faced the nation after that catastrophe, my words carefully chosen, my voice calm though shame pressed down like lead. Critics circled, enemies sharpened their knives, and even allies doubted me. Some whispered that I was too inexperienced, too naive, that I had been tested and found wanting. Yet within the humiliation, I found a hard lesson. Trust, but verify. Question what others assure you. And above all, never again allow others to dictate the pace of my decisions. It was a wound, yes, but one that hardened me, preparing me for trials far greater. Those trials arrived in the form of a confrontation that could have ended the world itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Even now, the name carries a weight that echoes through time. To wake one morning to the knowledge that nuclear weapons, capable of annihilation, sat just 90 miles from our shores, was to confront mortality on a scale the world had never faced. My generals urged immediate strike, swift aggression, confident that strength alone would protect us. But I knew better. I knew that one misstep could ignite flames that would consume millions. I remember the nights in the White House, maps spread before us, voices raised, tempers frayed. I remember staring out windows into the darkness, wondering if the dawn would come at all. The weight of history pressed upon me like a hand around my throat, and yet, in that pressure, clarity emerged. I would not be the president who led the world into fire. I would not be the man remembered for ending civilization. So I chose another path, one of patience and calculation, a quarantine, not an invasion, a line drawn firmly, yet without the first strike that my advisors demanded. Days passed in unbearable tension, the world holding its breath. Letters arrived from Moscow, some conciliatory, others threatening, each one a riddle wrapped in the paranoia of the Cold War. At night I lay awake, my back aflame, my mind racing with possibilities, knowing that a single mistake could doom us all. And then, at the edge of catastrophe, a shift. Concessions made in secrecy, promises hidden from the public, face saved on both sides. The missiles were withdrawn, the world exhaled, and for a moment I was seen not as inexperienced but as steady. Strength had come not through fire but through restraint, and history for once bent away from disaster. That crisis left scars no one could see. My trust in the military's judgment was forever shaken. My awareness of mortality deepened, and yet it gave me something I had not possessed before: authority. Even those who doubted me were forced to acknowledge that I had faced the abyss and stepped back without flinching. But victory in one arena did not silence the storms in others. The struggle for civil rights tore at the fabric of the nation, demanding not only words but courage. I had long spoken of equality, yet action came slowly, restrained by political caution and the realities of power. Activists marched, voices rose, blood was shed, and I could no longer remain half-committed. When I stood before the nation and declared civil rights a moral issue, not just a political one, I knew I had crossed into dangerous ground. The enemies it earned me were not distant. They lived within my own country, seethed within the very halls of power. All the while, rumors swirled in the shadows. Whispers of alliances with men whose names were spoken in fear, of private indulgences that could ruin reputations, of affairs carried out recklessly. I wore the mask of composure, the mask of Camelot, but behind it, contradictions multiplied. I was both idealist and opportunist, visionary and reckless, faithful to the image yet vulnerable to the temptations of secrecy. The FBI watched, enemies collected stories, and still I pressed forward, knowing that to falter was to be devoured. Through it all I carried the weight of my hidden illness, the cocktail of treatments that sustained me, the knowledge that my body was failing even as my star rose. Few knew the truth, fewer spoke of it, but I felt it every morning when I struggled to rise, every evening when I collapsed behind closed doors. The nation saw vitality, I felt fragility. And yet perhaps it was that very fragility that made me grasp so fiercely at every moment, every chance to act boldly before time ran out. History remembers those years as luminous, but I remember them as precarious. Every triumph shadowed by risk, every step forward dogged by whispers, every smile masking exhaustion. I was the leader of the free world, yet I remained the same boy who had fought against frailty in hospital beds, who had swum through burning seas, who had learned to survive not by strength alone, but by refusing to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. The stage was larger now, the stakes infinitely higher. And though I could not know it then, the road ahead was narrowing, leading me toward a day when the masks would be stripped away, when the glamour of Camelot would collide with the cruelty of fate. Power, once gained, does not quiet the shadows, it multiplies them. As the years passed in the White House, I began to feel not only the glow of admiration, but the tightening coils of suspicion, the whispers in corridors, the sense that every decision deepened both loyalty and resentment. The struggles within the nation itself grew sharper, and though the image of Camelot still shone brightly in the press, behind the curtains the seams strained. Civil rights, the defining moral struggle of our time, placed me in a crucible. I had spoken of justice, of freedom, of equality, but speaking was no longer enough. The marches swelled, the leaders pressed harder, and the violence against them spilled across television screens into American homes. To act meant to alienate allies in Congress, to risk political survival. To delay meant to betray the very promise of America. I felt the pressure building like a storm, each day bringing reports of arrests, bombings, children facing hatred on their way to school. When I finally stood before the nation and declared civil rights a cause that demanded action, I knew I was stepping into dangerous waters. The reaction was immediate. Praises from some, fury from others, and beneath it all, the quiet certainty that powerful enemies were marking my name. And those enemies were not only political. The shadowy ties that had once seemed advantageous now became threats. My family's connections to men whose influence stretched from smoke-filled rooms to gambling halls, the rumors of debts owed, favors exchanged, began to circle. I had dined with kings and prime ministers, but it was the whispers of associations with men of darker reputations that haunted me most. Some said my election had been secured not only by money, but by arrangements unspoken, alliances too unsavory to acknowledge. Whether truth or exaggeration, perception mattered as much as fact, and perception grew dangerous. Then there were the whispers of my private life, secrets hidden behind the polished image of a devoted husband and father. Affairs carried out recklessly, moments of indulgence that, if revealed, could have shattered the carefully maintained illusion of Camelot. Some of these liaisons were with women of influence, others with women tied to powerful and dangerous men. My enemies collected these rumors like daggers waiting for their moment. I carried the weight of knowing that scandal could strike at any time, unraveling everything. Even within the walls of power, betrayal lurked. The intelligence agencies I relied upon also watched me, filing reports, tracing movements, analyzing my weaknesses. Some within the military distrusted me, still angered by what they saw as hesitation during the Cuban crisis, convinced that my restraint had cost them victory. I knew that loyalty in Washington was always conditional, that allies today could turn into adversaries tomorrow. Yet the depth of hostility, the quiet determination among some to see me undone, was a reality I sensed more keenly with each passing month. My body, meanwhile, betrayed me in silence. Outwardly, I was the picture of youth and vitality, smiling on yachts, tossing footballs with my children, standing tall at podiums. In truth, I lived by routine injections, a pharmacy's worth of pills, and a determination that bordered on defiance. The pain was constant, a dull roar beneath every step, every smile. At times, the treatments themselves carried risks that no one fully understood, strange substances coursing through my veins, experiments masked as remedies. Some nights, as I lay in bed, I wondered whether my own cure might one day become my undoing. Yet even as shadows lengthened, I pressed forward, driven by urgency. I knew time was not a luxury I possessed. Perhaps it was that knowledge of mortality, of frailty, that made me act boldly where others hesitated. I reached for peace talks, sought to ease the Cold War's grip, spoke of a world where nuclear terror might give way to cooperation. At the same time, I pushed for justice at home, knowing that to delay was to betray generations yet unborn. Each decision added to the weight pressing on me, but each also deepened the conviction that I could not afford to leave the stage without trying to bend history towards something better. But the contradictions could not be denied. I was both visionary and flawed, both hero and sinner, both the champion of ideals and the keeper of secrets. The press saw Camelot, but behind those gilded doors, the truth was far messier. And the mess could not remain hidden forever. Friends warned me of plots, of danger, of hatred that simmered in places far beyond political debates. I brushed it aside, convinced that leadership always carried risk, that fear could not dictate destiny. Still, in quiet moments, I wondered. I felt the walls closing in, the sense that too many enemies had gathered, that too many shadows had thickened. The whispers grew louder, in the streets, in the halls of government, even in the private corners of my own thoughts. I had risen higher than many ever dreamed, but the higher one climbs, the sharper the knives that wait. And though I pressed forward, smiling for the cameras, speaking words of hope, deep inside I sensed the truth. The path ahead was narrowing, and it would not stretch as long as I once imagined. The autumn of that year carried with it a heaviness I could not quite name. Perhaps it was the long accumulation of battles, the endless parade of crises, or perhaps it was something more elusive, an intuition that time itself was tightening around me. I had always lived with the awareness of mortality, but in those months it pressed closer, like a shadow following too near. My days were filled with the usual rhythm of speeches, meetings, decisions, Yet beneath it all lingered the quiet knowledge that enemies multiplied, and that danger was no longer a distant possibility, but a presence, drawing nearer with every mile traveled. The trip to Texas was meant to be a gesture of unity, a chance to mend political fractures and to demonstrate strength in a region where support had grown uncertain. I knew the risks, of course. Reports arrived daily, threats, letters, warnings from those who claimed to overhear whispers of violence. But politics is built on exposure. You cannot lead from behind locked doors, and I refused to cower from the people I was elected to serve. The motorcade was scheduled, the appearances planned, the routes mapped. Smiles and handshakes awaited, and though some around me worried, I chose to press forward. I remember the morning air as we prepared for the journey, the sun breaking through with deceptive gentleness. Crowds gathered with cheers, the sound of their voices lifting me momentarily above the fatigue that clung to me. Their faces, eager, hopeful, curious, reminded me of why I had endured so much, why I had concealed pain behind smiles, why I had risked secrets and carried burdens. They reminded me that leadership, however fragile, was always about connection, about letting people believe they mattered to the man who bore their trust. And yet, even as I smiled and waved, I could not escape the flicker of unease. I had been warned. Friends had urged caution. Advisors had whispered that the atmosphere was hostile. My own thoughts betrayed me in private moments. What if the warnings were right? What if this trip carried with it something more than politics? But then I would silence the thought, reminding myself that every leader faced danger, that to yield to fear was to surrender the very essence of the role. The days before Dallas felt strangely heightened, as though each hour carried an edge of unreality. Meetings blurred together, conversations floated by, but certain details etched themselves into memory with sharpness I could not ignore. The look in my wife's eyes as she prepared for the journey, the way my aides spoke with a nervous cadence, the subtle tension in the air whenever security was discussed. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. On the morning of that final drive, I felt an unusual calm. Perhaps it was resignation, perhaps defiance, perhaps the simple weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long. I greeted the crowds as we moved through the streets, the sound of cheers rising and falling like waves. The motorcade glided forward, the sun glinting off chrome, the air alive with excitement. From the outside, it must have seemed a picture of triumph. The young president, his elegant wife at his side, adored by the people. But within, I felt something different. Each cheer sounded distant, each face blurred at the edges, as though I were watching it all through glass. There is a moment just before fate strikes, when time itself seems to hesitate. I cannot say whether I sensed it in the sudden stillness of the crowd, or in the way the air seemed to thicken, but I remember the strange clarity that overtook me. I thought of my children, of their laughter echoing through the halls of the White House. I thought of my brothers, their ambitions entwined with mine. I thought of my father, who had dreamed of this moment, and of my mother, who had insisted on perfection. And I thought of the ocean, of the night I swam through fire and black water, clinging to survival against impossible odds. That same current of inevitability coursed through me now. What followed came swiftly, brutally, a tearing of reality that no words can fully capture. The sound of the crowd shifted, fractured into screams. The motorcade jolted, voices rose in panic. The world turned into fragments of motion and noise. In those shards of time, I felt myself lifted out of the moment, as though the body I had fought to sustain for so long no longer belonged to me. The pain I had carried, the secrets I had hidden, the burdens I had borne, all of it dissolved into silence. For the nation, that day became a wound that never fully healed, a story told in gasps and questions, in memories replayed endlessly. For me, it was the end of a road I had long sensed would be shorter than others dreamed. I had lived with urgency because I knew the fragility of time. I had carried contradictions because there was never space for purity and power. And in that final moment, as history closed around me, I became less a man, and more a symbol. My story unfinished, my legacy left for others to shape. The fall had come, swift and merciless, yet in its wake myths would rise, memories would harden into legend, and the name I carried, once frail, once doubted, once whispered with skepticism, would echo across generations. Part 9. A nation shattered. The hours after my fall did not belong to me. They belonged to a nation that gasped in disbelief, to families huddled around televisions, to strangers on sidewalks frozen mid-stride as voices announced that their president was gone. The world seemed to tilt, the rhythm of ordinary life torn apart in an instant. I was no longer a man but a headline, no longer a voice but an echo in millions of homes. They wept in living rooms, in factories, in schools. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply sat in stunned silence. And as the news spread across oceans, leaders abroad spoke with trembling voices, some in sorrow, some in calculation, each aware that history had just shifted beneath their feet. My wife, whose grace had long been the crown of our image, now became its mourner. The pink dress she wore that day, stained and unwashed, became a symbol more powerful than any speech I had given. She stood with strength the world had not expected, walking beside my coffin, guiding our children, facing cameras with eyes that held both devastation and resolve. In her silence, the myth of Camelot grew even stronger. The people saw not only tragedy, but nobility in grief, and they clung to it because the truth, the violence, the chaos, the unanswered questions, was too brutal to hold bare. The investigations began almost before the echo of the shots had faded. Names were spoken, suspects captured, explanations offered in tones too rehearsed, too certain. The official story was written quickly, printed in black and white, but behind it whispers rose like smoke. Could it really have been so simple, so clean? One man, one rifle, one moment that altered the course of the world? Or was there more? Hidden hands, silent conspiracies, layers of truth too dangerous to reveal. In the years that followed, the questions multiplied, each answer spawning new doubts. My death became not only a wound, but a riddle, and the nation would never stop trying to solve it. For those who lived through it, the memory remained frozen. They could recall exactly where they were, what they heard, who stood beside them. It was as if time itself had branded the moment into every soul. They remembered the sound of radios breaking the news, the faces of newscasters pale with shock, the sight of black-draped horses carrying my casket through Washington's streets. Children wrote letters, mothers lit candles, fathers bowed their heads. The collective grief blurred into ritual, a mourning so vast that it seemed to hover above the country like a storm that refused to break. And yet, as grief settled into history, a strange transformation began. My flaws, my secrets, my contradictions receded, softened by distance. What remained was an image, polished and untouchable, the young president, the glamorous family, the golden years of Camelot. I became less a man remembered for his mistakes and more a symbol remembered for his promise. The words I had spoken, the dreams I had sketched, grew brighter in absence than they ever had in presence. But for those closest to me, the myth offered little comfort. My brothers carried the weight of unfinished ambitions, stepping into paths shadowed by tragedy. My children grew in the glare of a name too heavy for innocence. My wife endured whispers, scrutiny, the unrelenting gaze of a world that demanded she remain an icon when she was only a woman who had lost her husband. Their grief was real, raw, unpolished, untouched by the myth that soothed the masses. Still, I became a story told again and again in classrooms, in documentaries, in hushed conversations where people wondered aloud what might have been if the motorcade had passed without incident, if the shots had never rung out. Would the war in Southeast Asia have unfolded differently? Would civil rights have advanced faster or slower? Would the Cold War have thawed or burned hotter? My absence became a canvas upon which endless possibilities were painted, each one reflecting the hopes and fears of those left behind. Even now, decades later, the questions linger. Some hold to the official account with steadfast certainty. Others see shadows and secrets at every turn. My death became a mirror for the nation's anxieties, a stage upon which trust and doubt have battled endlessly. And though answers may never be found, the search itself has become part of the legacy. I was gone, yet I remained. In the speeches replayed, in the photographs frozen in time, in the myths told to children who had never seen my face in life, I became not only a president, but a symbol of youth interrupted, of promise unfulfilled, of the fragility of both power and time. My story no longer belonged to me. It belonged to history, and to every voice that whispered my name with longing, sorrow, or suspicion. That day in Dallas did not simply end a life, it fractured a nation's innocence. And though years have passed, the echo still lingers, carrying with it the same unanswerable question: what might have been if fate had given me just a little more time? There is a strange quiet that settles over a life when it is finally allowed to be seen as both promise and cautionary tale. Listen closely now, because this is the part I have saved for last. The part where the noise softens and the shape of what I was can be held in the palm of the hand examined, without the glare of headlines or the heat of accusation. What we call legacy is not a single truth handed down. It is a conversation stretched across generations, a patchwork of memory, rumor, praise, and regret. If you let it, that conversation can teach more than triumph ever could. I have been remembered as a figure of light, youth, glamour, possibility. I have also been remembered as a man of contradictions, a leader who flirted with recklessness, a husband who failed to be faithful in private, a public servant who sometimes relied too heavily on private remedies for private pain. Both images are true, because human beings are not single notes but chords, pleasant and dissonant in the same breath. To understand that is not to excuse, nor is it to condemn. It is to accept the complexity that makes any life worth studying. There are lessons in the way myth softened what was messy. People need symbols to anchor their hopes. In the immediate aftermath of loss, the world reaches for tidy stories that promise meaning, a life distilled into an emblem, a narrative that comforts by removing ambiguity. Camelot became a refuge for a grieving nation because it offered beauty against brutality, a simpler storyline when the real one was jagged and full of questions. But the danger of symbols is that they can obscure the very human lessons the messy truth provides. That leaders are vulnerable, that power can seduce and corrupt, that decisions carry consequences that ripple beyond intention. I have often thought about the hunger for youth in leadership, the way novelty can be mistaken for virtue. A fresh face can awaken attention and hope, but novelty is no substitute for institutional wisdom. The truth is subtler. Progress needs both the courage to imagine and the patience to build. Rhetoric can inspire, but it is structures and steady work that hold change in place. We must teach the next generations to love ideas without worshipping image, to demand substance beneath the smiles. That is one of the quiet debts I owe, to have shown the shine of possibility, even as I sometimes mistook sparkle for foundation. Another lesson is about the grain of power itself. The exercise of authority without humility is brittle. In moments of crisis, the urge to prove strength can become a seduction toward irreversible acts. My shaking with fear during the Cuban confrontation taught me that restraint can be the bravest choice, a truth that endures when technologies make destruction easier and decisions faster. Leadership should cultivate listening as much as speech, patience as much as bravado. The world today moves with speed my generation could not have imagined. That speed demands wisdom that resists the rush toward spectacle and embraces the slow work of prevention and repair. Privacy proved another fragile currency. I guarded parts of myself because I feared shame, because the facade of perfection had been an armor in a household where tenderness was thin. But secrecy breeds vulnerabilities. When private compromises meet public responsibilities, reputations can unravel and enemies can find leverage. Transparency is no cure-all, but opacity often hands power away to rumor and manipulation. In that sense, my life speaks to the need for leaders who can admit weakness and ask for help without seeing confession as fatal. Vulnerability, rendered honestly, can be a bridge rather than a fissure. I must also speak of the tone of public life, the way media shapes not just messages but memory. In my time, television created new pressures, faces burned into living rooms, gestures multiplied by instant replay. Today, the press is faster, louder, more fragmentary, and with that comes a double edge. The capacity to reach millions is marvelous, but in the rush, nuance is often lost. We teach our children to value checks and sources and slow reflection. We must also teach them to resist the seductive certainty of viral narrative. History, lived, is complicated. Headlines reduce it to a slogan. Cherish sources that dig, voices that persist, and skepticism that tempers faith. There is a tenderness I wish to leave for those who lead after me. Take care of your health, so your decisions are not clouded by desperation. I know what it is to make choices in the shadow of a failing body, to press forward with medication as if it were armor. Let medicine be medicine, not a talisman to prop up performance. The temptation to hide faults is ancient. The remedy is older still. Honesty, reliable counsel. The humility to step back when the work demands someone healthier. This is not moralizing, it is practical. Nations cannot afford leaders whose personal crises become public catastrophes. The burden of office deserves stewards who are not only visionary, but also whole enough to sustain the work. And yet, for all the warnings, I would not erase the urgency that burned in me. If a life has the chance to bend history in favor of justice, to ease the threat of annihilation, to nudge a nation toward greater equality, that fire is worth the risk. The measure of any leader may well be this balance: daring enough to imagine better, restrained enough to avoid reckless ends. Courage without wisdom is ruin. Wisdom without courage is stagnation. The task for those who follow is to hold both in hand. I think too of how grief changes a people. My death became a flashpoint, a mirror that reflected the nation's own anxieties and hopes. When a public figure falls, the mourning is not solely private. It becomes a public rite, an opening for reflection. Use such moments to teach history honestly, not to entomb myth as unquestionable truth. Let young people study the whole of a life with its contradictions and learn that complexity does not diminish meaning, it deepens it. There will always be those who search for conspiracies, who cannot accept a single account, who will stitch together theories from rumor and fear. I do not condemn the search. Inquiry is the heart of a free society. But balance curiosity with patience. The hunger for simple answers can skew judgment. Encourage institutions that investigate thoroughly and transparently, and guard them from politics so they can pursue truth even when it unsettles. And finally, to you who listen now in the stillness, take the story inward. If the life I lived can teach anything, it is that time is both brief and generous, that a single life can hold both brilliance and error, tenderness and cruelty, self-sacrifice and indulgence. The measure of a person is not a single deed, but a pattern of choices across years. Aim to be generous with others, honest with yourself, courageous in defense of what is right, and gentle in moments of private pain. These are small things perhaps compared to the sweep of history, but they are the fibers that make up a decent life. So let the lights dim and breathe with me now. History will keep its verdicts. Rumor will keep its shadows. The loud voices will continue to shout. But in the hush of night, when you are alone with your thoughts, consider this. Promise matters, but so does the work that sustains it. Power demands humility. Love demands fidelity. Courage demands restraint. We all carry contradictions. The truer we are about them, the easier it becomes to live with the weight of who we are. There is a final quiet I ask of you, not as a plea but as a small offering. Remember me as a man who tried, who faltered, who loved, who feared, who reached. Let the myths be balanced by the messy truths, And when you find yourself tempted to believe that greatness is made only of triumph, pause and look closer. Greatness is most honest when it admits its shadows. Now, breathe out. Let your eyes close if they wish. The story we shared has run its course for tonight. Outside, the world keeps moving as it always will, but somewhere in that motion are the soft lessons of a life lived loudly and complicatedly. Carry them gently. Sleep well,